This is our team. Josh Walter is the guy in the middle. That's our senior manager. And I did know Josh before he came and joined our team, not very well, but it took three phone calls to convince Josh that we were genuine about having him come from southern Victoria up to central New South Wales to manage our business. And when we finally got through to him, we agreed to go and have a meeting, to have an interview, which we did down near Geelong. And it was pretty quickly realised in that meeting that it was actually Lou and I who were being interviewed for the position, not Josh. And it was actually him interviewing us to see if we were fit for his services, which I really loved. And that was our introduction to aligning personalities in a business. And I think it's a really powerful place to go. And he went on to explain, he said that, I can manage your sheep, I can manage your business, I've done that for years, that's easy. This is between you and me. If you and I don't get on, then we've got nothing. And so that was our introduction to aligning personalities in business above skill set. We can certainly teach skill set if we need it, but if we've got the people aligned on a common goal, then that's when we can really start to drive our business in a positive direction. But that shone a light back on me as a business owner to really know what that common goal was, and then to communicate what we were actually aiming for, to allow our people to align behind that. And a simple example of what I did in the early days was to explain to our team that our stud enterprise compared to our commercial enterprise has a gross margin per hectare of anywhere from 3 to 7 times the commercial enterprise. So that then shone a light on the importance of biosecurity and the work on the boundary fence that we were doing, but also the importance of data collection, the data collection itself, but also the accuracy of that data being a really important point of how we breed forward with progressive genetics, as we'd like to think, but also communicating our story to a broader audience. But it also gave us a lot of confidence to destock, knowing that our core enterprise was very much the stud. So if we needed to destock early, then commercial sheep could go at the drop of a hat to make sure we keep grass in front of us for as long as we can before we find ourselves back in that containment situation again. But part of the focus on attracting and retaining the good people is making sure we have the infrastructure to have them want to come in the first place, but then also stay with us. And so accommodation was something that we were a bit weak on. The manager we had a few years ago came with a wife and 4 kids, and they were living in a cottage, which really wasn't suitable. So we made a commitment to them that we would upgrade the cottage, which happened to be at the back end of the place, until the old man came up with the idea that if we're spending that sort of money, we might as well start again from scratch and do something closer to town, which is where we went. So this is the house we built, which happened to coincide with a pretty dry time, but it was a long-term vision that we had of including good people to help us grow the business, and to do that we needed accommodation, and this was our step towards making sure our accommodation was up to scratch. Next one, please. Same thing with sheep yards, and this is probably a bit closer to home for a lot of people. That I grew up in sheep yards that you'd shudder to think of running a decent mob of sheep into these days. Wooden posts rotted off at the ground, iron posts drilled in beside them to try and stand them up. Simon's nodding his head. Patches in the fence that might have a bit of tin put across them to keep the sheep in. It was just a disaster, bits of wire sticking out all over the place. You rip your jeans or shirt. It's not a great place to be, but that was just what stock work was in the day, and I think we've got to do far better than that. Modern infrastructure, creating the efficiency that it does, allowing people who enjoy livestock to actually enjoy the livestock, not be frightened by it because the infrastructure is just not up to scratch. So we're certainly committed, just like we are at accommodation, to make sure that our stock facilities are up at the standard they need to be. And so, of course, this is our best set of yards, and so that's the one we use in these sorts of examples. This is our ram selling facility. The same concept applies here. We want an efficient space to be able to tie the rams up easily, to make it efficient for our people. It's a livestock job that they actually enjoy doing, getting ready for open days or sale days. It's a space that makes it very easy and efficient for our clients to turn up and go through the rams, to take in the data and take in the rams. There's no real stress anywhere, and it's just that concept flowing through across all the infrastructure we have on place, linking back to attracting and retaining the best people to allow us to grow the business in the direction we're wanting to go. In terms of business detail and growing it from the ground up, I think it's really important to include our team at a business level. We're at a time in a business only sort of 6 or 8 months ago where I was spending a lot of time, most of the week, in the office communicating with other professionals outside of our agricultural business, and I wanted our team to understand why that was going on. So we called them in, organised a meeting, and I put everything up on the board. I said, I'd like to take you right through the business. So we started with the direct costs. Here they all are. Here are the big ones. What are you seeing? What can we improve? Same with the overheads, right the way through, all the overheads. Here are the big ones. What are you seeing? Give me your feedback. Here's the labour cost. It's a massive one in our overheads. Wanted them to see the detail of the business, then took them right through the enterprise breakdown, showed where the stud compared to the commercial, how all that evolved, asset values, net worth, return on assets, the whole bit. And I said to them at the start of that meeting that I'd never felt more naked standing in front of you, but I wanted you to see this sort of stuff. And at the end of it, our stocky Heather, she's only 24 at the time, hadn't said much during the meeting. And I explained to her particularly that when we've got a mob of sheep in the yards and we let them out, we need that mob counted. We need that data accurately entered into AgriWeb, because it's that data and detail that then populates the stock flow that goes right through to the big figures that we use to communicate with the bank to take the big steps off, or in whatever form we want to grow the business. And it was that comment that just made us sit up that little bit taller, and you could just see that she had the buy-in, understanding that we wanted her involvement, we needed her involvement, and her role was important to the whole picture. So I think by including our team in what's going on at a business level gives us a chance to really draw the best out of our team, and it sort of gives them that responsibility and buy-in and creates that want to be in the position they're in. So that's, as a business owner, something I think is really important at a personal level to include, and we'll certainly do that again. But as you know, these times will come again. This was taken during the last drought, but it's as simple as knowing your numbers, I think, and with a good understanding of where the business is at and where the opportunities lie, we can make far better decisions, and it's less scary when we have less unknown to be dealing with. An example that I got in quite a heated discussion with another local friend, might have been 2 or 3 droughts ago, was the concept of whether we feed the grain out. And he was telling me the story that he put the grain in the silo, only cost him $80 a tonne, but at the time the grain he was feeding out was worth $400 a tonne. And I made the comment a bit flippantly, well, why don't you sell the sheep and the grain? And away he went. These sheep are too good to sell, we'll never get back in, and off he went. But there's an opportunity there, and I'm not saying which way is right or wrong, but if we know our numbers, we can make a decision on whether it is economically better to sell the sheep and the grain, wind the business back and potentially hibernate through a period of low production. Combine that with a restocking policy to give us the best opportunity to get going out the other end of the business. But it comes back to really knowing our data, knowing our numbers on all fronts that we are as business owners, to be able to then communicate to the team while we're doing things. But I like the idea of having a longer term horizon as well, and so the question of what does 2040 look like, I think is one that I quite like to keep in mind. There's often a lot of decisions to be made in the here and now, and today or this week, and some of them may or may not be important, and it's much easier to decide which ones we do need to focus on if we can then test them against a longer term horizon. So I just think that the idea of having a longer time frame in mind when we are making decisions in the heat of a situation is just a simple tool to keep in mind. And the concept of when we refuse to change, we don't hold on to the past, we just lose the future, really resonates with me as a breeder. I think we've got an industry that we just need to create some significant change in. But change is a constant. It will keep coming, so the better we adapt and move on with it, then the better we stand the chance of progressing. But if there were some simple take-homes to take with you, it would be to set that clear strategic direction, know what you're interested in, set a clear path to head towards that, align the people behind that direction to give them the best opportunity to contribute to the business growth. Know your numbers, I think, is an absolute must, and then be prepared to take your opportunities. And thank you.
Thanks, Chad, very much. That was very enlightening. And as someone who used to, in my past life, was a leadership development coach, I tell you what, the business strategy around bringing the team in and having them understand, intimately how the business works and, why the numbers are so important. Yeah, hats off to you. It's a terrific initiative, and I'm sure it's going to pay dividends for you. Okay, we'll just keep going with our case study presentations, and then we'll bring everybody back up onto stage for a bit of a panel discussion. So our next presenter is Simon Barton from Glen Oak. So he's a Wellington grazier and now wind farmer. So especially during the drought, he's obviously made the most of that diversification, and I think he'll be a really great presenter to talk about this today. So please welcome Simon to the stage.
Thanks, Tracy. Not quite as organised as Chad. No PowerPoint presentations from me, but I'll just speak from the heart and speak from experience. And I totally agree with everything that Chad's said. You made a lot of good points there of being organised and knowing your end goal and where your numbers are. I totally agree with that. And I'd be the first to admit that I probably didn't last drought. I think a lot of us was all, how long's a piece of string? When's it going to end? Stock, as Chad said, stock prices were quite good, so we were able to, offload stock and then and buy grain in for the remaining stock we had. That worked to an extent, and then the rains came, and then we were restocking, and then we had nothing to sell, and then we ended up in a financial drought for about 3 years while we were restocking without selling our surplus stock because we didn't have any. We just kept them to restock. So that was, the physical drought was really hard. It was emotional. It was taxing, and then the financial drought was, just as hard for the business as well. So, we're very fortunate at home that during the drought, they started building a wind farm, so we were a host landholder for, I've got 10 turbines on our place. The drought came at a really good time for the construction company for the wind farms because they did not have a day off for wet weather. They just kept going straight through. So, yeah, they certainly enjoyed the drought, but we didn't. But yes, look, this company, Infigen, they came to us in 2007, 2008. They asked us whether we're happy to host. They recognised from a wind farm map when they're doing a study of a wind farm down just south of Orange, and we were right on the edge of that map, and they realised that we were in a really windy spot, so they came up and approached us and quite a few neighbours and said, you know, would you be happy to go ahead? And so, you know, something I'd been thinking of for years, you know, out working in the sheep yards and the cattle yards when it's blowing a force 10 gale and it hasn't been much fun. I didn't know where to go to or who to turn to, but anyway, luckily they came to us. I put my hand up straight away, said, yes, but why not use this resource? You know, it's there. We get a lot of wind. We're very high. So you know, we were happy to do that. So they started the whole process of, you know, all the applications they had to put in through the EPA and the government departments, and then they started their wind monitoring. They did all that. They got all their figures, and they said, right, we're good to go. You know, drew up the lease agreement and said, you know, here we are for 25 years. You'll get X amount per turbine or per output of kilowatt. And yeah, no, we agreed with that. So yeah, then they started construction in 2016. Went through pretty much the whole drought, and then I think the turbines started turning in about 2019. And you know, we got a one-off construction payment in 2016 to soften the blow of the headaches that comes with construction, and you know, all the vehicle movements and the cut fences and everything like that. You know, we got around it. It was a headache, but we got around it. We got through it. So, and certainly that one-off payment certainly sweetened the deal and made it a lot easier to accept what was happening. So yeah, since then, you know, it did start to rain in 2019, I think it was, and actually, I think the 6th of January was, I think, the worst day that I can remember on the farm in my life. You know, we've been trying to manage the stock and the paddocks and the grass, what little grass was left, trying to manage it reasonably well, and I certainly wouldn't say I did manage it well, but we had destocked probably 50% at least, and you know, should have gone harder. But the 6th of January 2019, there was a storm that blew out from the east, and you know, we could hear it during the night, and it was, you know, the wind was blowing a gale. And I actually spoke to one of the wind farm managers because they got monitoring. They can monitor what the wind speed was, and they did say it got up to 120 kilometres an hour that night. I went out to feed my cattle the next morning, and I nearly cried. The cattle were fine, but up against my fences were half my paddock. They were just, and some else, you know, other people's paddocks too. The damage that wind had done was phenomenal, and you just can't replace that topsoil. You just can't scoop it up and put it back where it came from. It was just gone forever. So that was devastating to see that, and a real wake-up call going, oh my God, you know, we've done some real damage here. And I said to myself then, I said, this is going to take 3 or 4 years for this country to recover. Luckily, nature is a bit better healer than I thought, and you know, we actually, within 12 months, were, you know, looking pretty good. And to my, you know, absolute surprise, I was amazed how property bounced back. You know, hosting the wind farm has certainly helped us financially. From, you know, we were doing okay prior to the drought, and even during the drought, you know, wasn't too bad. But then, as I said earlier, you know, the financial drought came after when the rain started, and then we were nearly back on track, and then our stock prices crashed, and it was like, oh, okay, there's another kick in the guts, which we didn't really feel or see coming, and still was like, I still shake my head and go, I don't know why that happened, but it did. Anyway, we're clawing our way back, and hopefully we're going to see some good continued prices for some time now. But certainly hosting these wind turbines on the property, I've seen no detriment to our property, to our management. In fact, quite the opposite. It's improved our access. People say, oh, you know, what about your stock? I bet they hate it. Well, the stock don't. After the drought, we had 3 wet years, which sort of balanced our 3 dry years. And anyone that knows sheep very well, they don't like getting their feet really wet all the time. So We found our sheep camped on the pads around the turbines, on the roads that they created between the turbines, just to keep their feet dry, and they actually quite enjoyed that. In the middle of summer, in the heat, you'll quite often see them lined up in a row in the shade of the turbines of the towers, just accessing that bit of shade. So certainly, as far as for the livestock, they don't mind it at all. As I said earlier, the access has been improved through the whole property. We had a fire on our mountain a couple of years ago, started by lightning. Came out a couple of days after the lightning struck, and I know one of the furphies of when the wind farm was proposed, they had meetings around and they said, oh no, the RFS won't, they can't fight fires with planes or helicopters or anything like that when anywhere near a wind turbine. Well, they were flying within, I would say, 300 or 400 metres of a turbine, and around turbines, getting water out of dams. So that there's a lot of furphies around with the wind farms that, the cows weren't going to calve and the dogs weren't going to come out of kennels. Anyway, we haven't seen any of that. And yes, there was, certainly a reasonable amount of resistance, or some resistance, I'd say. But before we started, I put that down to change. People don't like change and they're frightened of it. So anything that's different, they like to be in their box. Anything that's different, they go, oh no, we can't handle that. What we found is that once these turbines were built and standing up and started spinning, we haven't heard anything from the naysayers or neighbours that were really opposed to them. They've just gone quiet. It's gone. So I'm presuming they've accepted it and say, well, it's actually not that bad. So that's pretty much my story. So I'm certainly happy to answer any questions later on.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, and I think, just the whole debate about renewable energy at the moment, I know it's a hot topic in the area, and I see a lot of the signs driving in. I'm the former Queensland State Director for the Clean Energy Council, so I've spent a lot of time, sitting in between councils, communities and renewable energy developers, and I think the industry is finally coming to terms with the fact that they do actually need to provide much broader benefits for the community. It's not just the host landholder that needs to get something out of the gig. And we need to work harder, I think, all of us, and that's where this collaboration idea comes in, of putting the right people in the room to really try and maximise the benefits of those developments for the broader community, neighbours as well as landholders. All right, we'll get into more discussion about that in the panel, I'm sure. Our next speaker, Justin Dickens from JAD Speckle Park. So runs the cattle farm with his wife and 2 sons. He's got considerable training in farm management systems, and he's served as a director on the board of the Speckle Park International, the Breed Society. Believes in the value of science and data to assist in his decision making and to measure his outcomes. So please join me in welcoming Justin.
Thank you, Tracy. Unlike Chad, I don't have a presentation. I will go back to what Chad mentioned about people's wellbeing and how important a team is. And we were very young in business when we went into that 3-year drought. My wife and I, we're first generation farmers. We were very highly leveraged, and we'd set off on a seed stock journey sort of through that period, and we hadn't had any income. I guess we're breeding up a breeding herd through that time. So it was a very taxing time for us with, financial commitments but it was our team that actually got us through it. It was not just our staff, but our mentors that helped guide our decisions for a positive outcome at the end of it. So I can't emphasise that enough, that your people are everything in these times when you're faced with adversity, and we're all, I guess, together smarter than one of us on our own. So we spent lots of time around the table discussing options and planning, for a positive outcome. I think we learned a lot of lessons, as everyone would have, I guess, and every drought's different, not just markets, but the way the rain falls, how long it goes for. So I don't think there's any, I guess, one fit solution, I suppose, to it. You've just got to approach every day as it comes and have a really strong plan. But the model that we now have in our business to create that, I guess, flexibility is not have all our eggs in one basket, as in breeding. So we never let our breeding herd get any more than about 50% of our long-term carrying capacity, and the other 50% we make up with a trading enterprise. And, in our situation, that's a mix of sheep and cattle, but it just allows us to remove the emotion out of destocking. And I find that easy, that we can protect that core, but if we can dump half our animals with very little emotion, it makes it much easier. One thing that I'm really passionate about is landscape management, and we saw that period. It went for a long time here in the Central West, and I don't think there were too many farms that didn't get quite down on residual dry matter and water use or water holding capacity. So there are a lot of hidden costs in not managing the way our animals are controlled on our landscape. And through that period we saw everything from people that destocked portions, people that built containment infrastructure to get the animals off the landscape into confined areas where they were fed. And we saw lots of people just feed them where they stood. And I have a very, very strong view on the negatives that come from leaving animals to roam the landscape and in hope for rain. Now, it's one thing bringing the feed in there and giving them a maintenance requirement, but it's what they do to the long-term perenniality of that country and the ability for that land to hold water when it does come. And as producers, as graziers, the only freebie that Mother Nature gives us is that water, and we can't control how it comes. But when it does come, I think it's our responsibility to actually hold it, and we can't do that without ground cover. So I'm very passionate about that. I'm very, it was difficult for us to destock and to confine animals and put our hand in our pocket to feed them through that period, but the perenniality that we retained at the end of it was the icing on the cake, because our feed bill is just one cost. At the end of it, if we're left with a landscape that requires renovation, or we can't hold the water to get recovery at the end, we've lost a lot. So, what Simon said about, that humus and that topsoil, it's extremely important, and it's very hard to measure, but how quickly your business bounces back will be determined by how you manage that and retain it. The other one that I'd like to talk a bit about is I guess, because of our situation, we're a new business and very highly leveraged. Our communication and the importance of communication with your financier. It was very difficult for us, but we got the utmost support from our bank, and we've grown a very, very strong relationship with our financier over that period, simply because we were in constant communication. They understood our situation. They knew we had a plan that involved a calculator heavily, and at the end of the day, we are running businesses and they've got to be viable. So, we had to make some tough decisions, but there were opportunities there, as Chad mentioned. I mean, I can remember in that last year of it, we had feeding down to a fine art. We had one young fellow working for us, and we were finished feeding at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we were there thinking, what are we going to do? We'd done a lot of work on infrastructure. We had everything maintained, and we did some sums, and there was an opportunity to feed some lambs. So we actually built containment infrastructure, and fed like 3,000 lambs. And that, I guess at the time, all we were trying to do is pay his wage. I didn't want to lose him. He was a great young fella, and we had truckies in the district that carted grain in and lambs out. Our stock agent, we I guess helped other businesses in the district going through drought at the same time by looking at an opportunity. And there wasn't a huge quid in. I think we might have made $30-40 a lamb or something. It might have only been 20, but it serviced the needs, and it gave us I guess we were still producing a product, and but there are positives at the end of it. I think that period created, it really grew our resilience. It grew our awareness and our education around, just the economics of agriculture, and we learned a lot about, through that period about our landscape and about how to best take care of it, I guess, for a bright future. So I'll leave that there. I'm obviously happy to take more questions on the floor. Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks so much, Justin. All right, well, I might just get the three of you to come up, if that's okay, and we'll just have a bit of a panel discussion. So audience members, please think about some questions that you might want to ask. I think, that was a really good range of local perspectives there, and some raw honesty about what happens through those droughts and the sort of lessons that are learned, what we could do differently next time. And we heard from Anthony in the session this morning, some of the data is showing, even regardless of climate change, that back thousands of years, droughts can run for a lot longer than what we've had in the last 100 years. So that's pretty scary in itself. But the flip side of that is the really good seasons can also run for a lot longer as well. So it's this whole thing, I think, about how do we plan for the worst, but take the best opportunities out of the best times. So I'd love you to think about that now. You know, you all three of you really mentioned the opportunities that drought presented. You know, if you had your time again, is there anything else that you'd do differently?
I could probably certainly start with that. There's probably lots of things I'd do differently, but as Justin and Chad have said, that, you know, every drought is different. So, you know, we never know the end date, but if we're prepared, and as Chad said, have our numbers, you know, worked out that what we need as a core stock, how much we're prepared to spend on those core stock, you know, our destocking options, you know, how we're going to look after our landscape. I think those goals are, you know, top of the tree. They've got to have them in the back of your mind, as well as the people management. You've got to manage the people well, because, you know, droughts are taxing times and they're very testing times, and, you know, no one's going around a drought with a smile on their face. So, you know, we need to look after each other, but have that plan in mind. And I certainly didn't in the last drought. I thought I was managing it the best to my ability on my breeding stock. You know, I did destock pretty much 50% of my sheep and my cattle. You know, in hindsight, I should have had that other enterprise option that wasn't emotional. You know, I love my livestock, so it was a really hard decision to even sell 50%. You know, there were more that, you know, that should have gone, but we were just, you know, as a family, I think we were just emotionally too involved with them. So lessons from the last drought, move forward. Hopefully I'm not going to have to put them into practice in the near future, but who knows, it could be next year.
Anyone else want to tackle that one?
Pick up on the just the business direction. I think one of the things we did at home was we were a bit unclear. We had, you know, the variability in this drought of high stock prices in a period of low feed, and so we delayed on our decision to destock, and so that comes back on me. I think I was probably led in a direction that took us down a feeding path. Had we stuck to what we normally do, which to my logic makes a bit more sense in destocking early, if we've got a 50% portion of the livestock that can go, if they go early, that buys so much time for the remaining 50%. So if we're prepared to pull that trigger early, that just opens so many doors, and the opportunities that come with that, you know, if we can be at least receptive to that. But the message for me was being clearer on the direction we're going, so that I'm not so easily pulled in different directions and creating that hesitation in our decision making.
Another thing that we did, I guess, constructed that period was a document that we still have in our file called a response to drought document, and that basically, we listed every mob of animals on our farm, or every class of animals, trading and breeding, and we reviewed it every single month, and that was, you know, if we got to a rain date or a date and it hadn't rained, what was the consequences of that on those animals, and then what was our decision? And we wrote down, and we had that, and we enacted that, and we were held to that, you know, not just by my wife and myself, but Charlie that worked for us and our business coach. We had to front up every month and say, well, if you didn't sell that mob, why not? You know, you committed to it a month ago. So that was a little tool that we built, and we still have it in the file, and we'll certainly pull it out again. We haven't spoken at all about, I guess, preparedness in relation to fodder, and, you know, we went into it with no fodder at all. And am I a believer of fodder conservation? Look, I think it's very much a personal thing, but I think if you don't store some away, you need to have a clear mindset. Are you going to procure fodder, or you know, are you just going to offload the animals? But I think there is a lot of positive to have a plan around that. We certainly have gone on and buried a fairly substantial amount of roughage now, because we found that with cattle certainly is the biggest killer in a beef business is the cost of roughage when you get into those sort of times. We can cart in high quality feed in the form of grain and cotton feeds and things like that, but when you're hauling, you know, $300 a tonne straw or rice straw, or, you know, those sort of products, they really do affect the bottom line. So, yeah.
I'm going to throw to the audience and see if there are questions that people want to ask the panel members.
I took on board that everyone, and I think we're probably the same, wouldn't have fattened so many stock early on in the drought and offloaded some pretty earlier rather than get to the end and be out of feed. But do you remember about 18 months ago when there was talk of a drought, and I think it was about the same time that the live sheep trade got pulled up, and everyone, like, the price just crashed because everyone was, I reckon, still gun shy from the previous drought and just off. As soon as it looked like it was going to be dry, they just offloaded straight away. And it's those who held their nerve certainly benefited because we've seen since then really record prices. How do we avoid those sort of scenarios? Like what, you know, I don't know if you guys offloaded 2 years ago or 18 months ago in response to that, but the old adage is, you know, buying the gloom and selling the boom, and it's hard to do it when everyone's doing the same thing. What would you suggest to avoid that or to take advantage of that?
Very easy to give an answer when we're not in the heat of the situation, but my broad answer would be that if we can see through the emotion, to see the facts of the situation, then we can make a much clearer decision as opposed to being led along with the tide if it's going in the wrong direction. Again, very easy to say, but there was a lot of emotion made in those decision-making times that you were just highlighting. The scars from the drought, that doesn't actually change the facts. The memory of the drought doesn't change the situation we're in, so if we can use our business intellect, know our numbers, to make an accurate decision based on the situation in front of us without being distracted too much by the emotion of past events or what may happen in the future, then I think that can help us steer through those situations. There were a number of variables agreed, you know, really strong weather forecasts that have since been shown to be inaccurate. There might have been a few culminating factors and maybe we can't see through it all. But if we can see through the emotion as much as we can to use the facts in front of us to make those business.
Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree that recent collapse in commodity prices, to me, still to this day, that hurt our business more than the 3-year drought. And it doesn't make sense to me, still doesn't, what happened, but I think it was, unfortunately, as producers, we drive the market up and we drive it down. And I guess we feed off each other's sentiment a lot of the time. And, you know, if you look back through that period, the South had more than enough capacity to be able to handle the pressure from the numbers here in the North that was drying out, but just didn't support it. And that was based on, you know, the fear of El Nino. And I think, you know, we're seeing the effects of that rolling on quite to this day. And I think, you know, financially, there was a lot of money torn up then. There was a lot of money on finance, on high-priced stock, and I think as an industry, it's a really important discussion that we need to have. I see some trends in the processing world, and you know, and a lack of I guess products out there, and you know, forward pricing that is desperately needed, because the reality is rural businesses today are far more leveraged than they were yesteryear, and we can't absorb those sorts of corrections in commodity prices like we used to be able to. So it's a we're not going to solve it here today, but there's a very big need at industry for a discussion around this, because, you know, it's going to be hard to romance the next generation into such a volatile industry that agriculture's become. So yeah, it is something that's very topical. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I will go back and reinforce Chad's first comment, saying, you know your numbers, because if you know your numbers, then you're halfway through the battle. The other thing that I would say is, you know, agriculture, there are so many variables. So if we can minimise the variables, that will help the outcome. If I wasn't a farmer, I think I'd be a weather forecaster, because they can get it so wrong and still have a job. And that makes it really hard as a farmer. And we've even seen that this year. We had 3 forecasts in the autumn of big rainfall for our area. And, you know, as farmers, you make decisions on some of these forecasts. All 3 of them failed. We got 0 out of, you know, one of them, bugger all out of the other 2. So, look, it does make it hard. You've got to take that emotion out, but you've got to also have that plan go, well, okay, I hear what they're saying, but if that doesn't happen, I'm going to stick to my plan.
Yeah, and I think Jill made the point this morning about, you know, there's a difference between knowing your numbers for the taxman and knowing your numbers, actually knowing your numbers. You know, what's really genuinely making you money in order to make those kinds of informed decisions and to be able to take the emotion out. I think it was a really well-made point. Anybody else got questions or comments on the basis of what's been said?
Question for Simon. During the drought, and they were putting up the wind farm, the turbines, if another drought's around the corner, do you see that other farmers in the area may be more accepting and be able to diversify their business when they're at a time where cash flow is an issue, they've destocked, And how, from your experience, do you get that into the community, that it's a great thing to diversify away from your core business for a period?
Yeah, I'd certainly, there was the negatives towards the wind farm before it was built. I guess there were neighbours that saw, it all happening and realised that we were, getting paid for something, which we didn't have to do a lot for. So, and that certainly helped us more so post-drought than during the drought, because that's when our income stream actually started being produced by the wind. And it helped us through that financial drought after the physical drought. Look, I think being within the community, I've sort of found that I've got about 80% support for the wind farm and 20% negative, which I consider pretty much a win-win situation for the community. Not only do we get paid for the output of the wind that's generated by the turbines, but the community itself also gets a benefit fund through the company that hosts the proponent of the wind farm. So all our sporting clubs, our clubs, whatever clubs are out there that are looking for some help, there's up towards about $70,000 a year comes into the community. And, I'm been fortunate enough to be on that committee that looks over all these applications, and we have some input into who's successful and who's not. But to me, that's a big win for the community, and I can see that our community should benefit and will benefit from these future projects that are coming to fore now. Certainly there's, I think the solar guys are having to put in now. I think initially the first couple of solar farms that were built here, there was no community fund, so that left a bit of a sour taste in some people's mouths. But now I think they're all on board, so they're all going to have to put into our community. So it's not only just as a host farmer that's benefiting; it will be the whole community. It's a big project. What they're building. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone's got that resource. So if you're lucky enough to have it and you're happy enough to host it, then I'd certainly be in full support of having it.
And Chad, I think you're also looking at it or doing it in the process of doing. Do you want to comment on the renewable energy diversification?
Yeah, there's a big project going on behind us. We've just got a few turbines coming onto our place. We're on the very edge of it. But the thing that really stands out in my mind was we had two people who were the key connection points for the power, and they were both really adamant that if there wasn't community consultation that led to neighbours being included in the conversation as well as the compensation, then they didn't want to play. So it was a really strong negotiating point that led to conversations, not just with the host, but also the neighbours. And that's led to neighbour agreements, which is, I think, becoming more standard around wind farms as they're built from here on. Quite different, I think, to Simon's wind farm. I don't think that approach was in place. Simon, you could probably comment in more detail, but it does seem like there's been long-term relationships that have been broken on the back of that initial stage development in wind. I think that space has changed, and I think we can create these real community wins across not just hosts, but neighbours, as well as the whole community. And I think that social fabric can be strengthened on a lot of different fronts when we have these renewable energies producing such income for the whole community. I think that's a real win.
Yeah, I think I'll add there, just from my experience, it's always beneficial for the communities that have got their act together. So I notice the councils that are proactive about it and that have really, they know what their community needs, and they can put forward a pretty good plan straight up. As soon as the renewable energy developers hit town, they are going to do better out of it, than you're sort of scrambling and doing it project by project. It seems like your benefits are less when it's done that way. And I think Chad's right, the industry's moving that way anyway. I might just come back to something that Justin was talking about, which was around soil, and the importance of the kind of quality of your soil and your topsoil. Like, is there anything there that we should be talking about in terms of during the good times, and it's, I guess, more than just coverage, but should there be more put into regenerative type of agriculture? Is that something that we should be thinking about during the good times to prepare for drought?
I don't know whether I'm going to offend people or not in what I'm about to say, but I came to the Yeovil district in 2008, and since I've been in our district, unfortunately, as a community, I believe the productivity of our community and the land has declined. And I've thought about it quite a lot in the last sort of couple of years, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that our district produces less protein than it did 15 years ago. And that's a real concern. And I know we've been through that 3-year drought and we've had 3 extremely good years since. And, you know, the pain of that drought doesn't subside the day it rains. But I'm seeing a landscape that's going back to a more native state on country that's tripled in value over the same time, and observing an inability to get a return on assets on that land at its current land value. It's quite extraordinary actually to watch the variation and just drive around a district and look at the anomaly from one farm to the next in productivity. And you know, I know there was a I suppose it wasn't even a decade ago where everyone was, you know, it was quite a topical thing, how are we ever going to feed this growing world population? But I think it's a non-argument in my view. When I look at just our piece of land and the productivity of it today to what it was when we took it on 10 years ago, I think as producers we are running at very, very suboptimal levels in relation to productivity. And do we need to rape the landscape to achieve productivity? Absolutely not. But you know, we're in a high rainfall area here, and when you look at, it's pretty simple. If you went and had a discussion with any of your local merch stores and asked how much phosphorus and sulphur has been sold, I guarantee you they're selling less single super today than they were 10, 15 years ago. And whether we like it or not, we are net exporters of those products out of our country, and we can naturally cycle a certain amount of that. But you can't keep trucking sheep, cattle, wool, grain out the front gate without replenishing those nutrients. So I'm pretty passionate about it. I think that the future's bright for those that manage productive businesses. But the cold reality is that, you know, the variation in productivity is enormous in our community. And, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I mean, we're a first generation business that went in at 30% equity, and you know, we're not much better today than when we started, but we've grown a business that's twice as productive as what it was when we took it on. So I'm pretty passionate about that stuff, and I think that as the industry we've got to look at, you know, at trying to maximise what we can do with what we've got. Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on that? I think one of the other themes that came out from some of the case studies was around getting external support and help, you know, whether it be your banking and your accounting kind of expertise or agronomy or whatever it is. Can you talk to us about, is there anything that we should be thinking about in terms of drought preparedness to get access to that sort of resource, and how have you made the most of that?
I'll have a quick go with that one, but I think we're very fortunate where we live. I think we've got a great group of, I was going to say young farmers, but we're all getting a little bit long in the tooth now. Mind you, I've still got my dad at home and he's nearly 95, so we're a bit younger than him. But we've had a great group of young farmers around us, and there's another group coming in now that are on a similar wavelength of, you know, want to be productive. They want to be moving forward rather than staying where they are. So we can rub off each other. We can meet with each other. We have a local drinks group that hosts drinks once a month on a Friday, which we share around. And, you know, it's that sort of support which has helped a lot of us through. You know, I think if you're different communities that, you know, if you're further out west and it's further away from everyone, it's probably a lot harder. So I think we've been really lucky here, and we can, you know, I know when we were in our 20s, I think we had a group together. We would meet literally once a month and, you know, talk facts and figures and what was working, what was good and what wasn't working for each other's farms and how we could help each other. Those sort of things, I think, are really, really proactive as a community, and, you know, certainly I'd encourage that sort of support wherever you live, wherever you can set it up.
I remember when we came down here in 2008, like the Little River Land Care was one of the most progressive land care in the state, and we're at a, you know, farmers teaching farmers event every other week, and we seem to have lost that to a large degree, and I think that's a shame. But yeah, absolutely, I think that, you know, not just in drought, but as producers, we probably don't interact enough and learn from each other and our experiences and share what we have as producers. And I think that's where the real gains are. Is the old, what I said up there at the start. We're all smarter than what we are individually if we get together, and that's something that I think that there's a real big need for, and I think we've actually gone backwards in our community in regard to that.
Yeah, I agree, boys. That social fabric's a really important part of the mix. If I could take that to another level, I think you've covered the local side of it well. The fabric of our business includes a lot of other experts, and I think as the business grows, it grows the affordability of bringing in outside advice. And so if I rattle through the people that have a significant impact on our business, we've got some professional help at a marketing level, we've got professional help at a genetic level, we've got professional help at a banking level, not just a bank manager, but we've recently engaged a finance broker. That has put us in a position to negotiate to the bank to take a big step to go off-farm with a commercial property in Brisbane in this round. There's a lot of expertise that come in a different form, and we really focus. I talked a bit about the importance of our team and that team mentality within the people working immediately in the business with us, but it's also the outside influences that we have around the business that is so important to be able to grow the business, and in whatever direction the business may be wanting to grow. It could be continuing to steam ahead in an agricultural focus, no issue with that. For us, we're wanting to do more off, so there's a different range of expertise, and so even just having contact to a real estate agent in Brisbane in this particular case for our business is opening doors that we wouldn't otherwise find, and on it keeps going. So if we have that mindset of including people, it really is a massive door to open, or many doors to keep opening if we want to go down a path to include the expertise from people from a whole range of different aspects. Yeah,
so important to be open to that though, isn't it? One thing is the affordability, as you mentioned, like you've got to be able to afford them. But the other thing I think is just being open to that. And I think that's part of the challenge of us dealing with the change, whether it be weather or technology or whatever. It's just, trying to be open to that and to take on other points of view and be able to use that.
Getting out of their way, I think, is a great way of looking at it, Ollie, and I appreciate that question. With managers in the past, we had different systems in place to the current personalities we're working with at the moment. So in the past, we allowed him to buy a spray rig and then employed him as a separate business to do our spraying, which gave us the convenience of knowing we could tap into that at the drop of a hat. It gave him the extra income of having another little sideline business that complemented what we were doing. That just for example, the previous manager also bought a bit of country right next door, and so we gave him access to our machinery. So there were a few ways of linking, having them involved with what we're doing, but also creating something extra. And I really like the concept of creating something extra above and beyond a salary. And it may not be more money. It's not everyone's go-to. It may be some extra responsibility. It could be recognition in the community. It could be a whole range of different things. But I think it's a really good space to open up if we can start to create something beyond just the financial package that they're on.
Can I add to that in that I've spent more of my life as an employee than I have as an employer. And one thing that I thought a lot about when I was in the workforce and managing for people is that it's a great shame that we haven't designed models that link the remuneration of a manager or staff to the performance of the farm. And it's something that I think would create enormous productivity gains and benefits and drag high quality people into the industry if we could design models that linked, they may have to have a retainer and then a percentage of earnings, but there's no greater motivation to get out of bed. Certainly when I was managing, I would have absolutely jumped at an opportunity. I think it's probably been achieved a bit more in countries like New Zealand where there are lots of equity partnership type arrangements, but if you've got a high quality person there that is operating at, and at 70, 80%, I think it'd be a great way to get them to 90 or 100 if you could give them that connection with financially to the performance of the farm. It shouldn't be that hard, I don't think. Like, we're very transparent with our staff, with our financials. We have monthly meetings. They know, they know what's at stake and that how our business operates, and I think they treat it with respect by knowing how tight things can be at times, and I don't see any negative. But I think as a culture, generally, we like to keep that financial side of that away from our staff, and I think that's a shame. I think we could benefit if we because we've got great people that work for us, young, and it's a great way to educate the young ones coming through. Like, we've got a young fellow that's heading off to Marcus next year or the year after, and it'd be a great segue for him to go into his uni if he actually had a pretty broad, understanding of the financials of the business.
Any other questions? I think I'd really like to pick up on Chad's point, because I think it's really key around the long-term planning. Like in this country, and we bemoan the fact that politicians, tend to operate in their election cycles, but I think we all kind of fall into that trap, and we do tend to only think quite short-term. And I think that gets us into trouble, particularly when you're talking about drought resilience. We can get lulled into a false sense of security. It's all lovely and green out there at the moment, so we don't really need to worry about it. And, part of that is the fact that we didn't get the audience that we thought we would to something like this, How do we encourage and incentivise people to take that long-term view?
I feel like that was aimed at me, and I haven't got an immediate answer for you, Tracy.
You do it, so.
Yeah. Look,
What made you do it? Why did you do it? Why did you take that real long-term view? What was the incentive for you to do that?
Well, we could take that quite deep, I guess. The old man was good enough to give me plenty of responsibility at a young age, and so in my mid-20s, I was married at 23. By 25, I had a reasonable grip on the reins in the business, so I had a chance to make decisions and make mistakes, more importantly, to then learn from and steer the business in the direction we wanted to take it. But there were times when we were really up against a wall, that decisions were going badly, business was performing badly. The question's asked, why do we keep doing what we're doing? And the answer I came up with quietly to myself was because I don't really know what else to do. And I guess it was probably with that in mind, and I'm probably just shooting the breeze on the back of your question, Tracy, it was probably with that in mind, not knowing what else to do, that made me think, well, if we're not stuck in this, but if this is what we're doing for a long time, then we're going to need a longer term horizon in mind. And with a longer term horizon in mind, it's I suppose the catalyst to help get through the ruts, get through the challenging periods in whatever form they come. And it's drought that we've been talking a lot about now, but there's other reasons that businesses can face some really tight cash flow. Succession was one for us. So we bought my brother out when I was still in my 20s, and that put a lot of pressure on the business. It happened to coincide with off-farm assets being transferred to my brother. We maintained a lot of country and the debt. So we lost the income of the off-farm assets, and so we then ran into a low cash flow period with a heightened debt and a poor business performance. So that pushed us into a situation of having to sell country. So it's thanks to the previous generation that we had country we could sell, but that was a massive emotional change that the Taylor family was selling country. But once we got over that hurdle, removed the emotion from the situation to look at the situation clearly for what it was, it's a very simple step to take. Free up some capital, get through the succession stage, and then we could rebuild the business from there. And that was the door that opened in the commercial front. And I suppose commercial property's been something in our business ever since then, and that was over 20 years ago. But back to your point about having a long-term horizon, it's almost been pushed on us through a lack of options, and so a need or a desire to keep options in front of us is probably what's been the catalyst for that.
Yeah, and I think this idea about, it kind of helps. What's the saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Whereas at least if you've got the plan, even during the tough times and the emotional kind of drain of all of that, if you've got that clear plan, it seems to me that gives you some comfort. It's like some kind of guide, some kind of steer that almost takes the pressure off a bit from you having to do that, really reactive kind of emotional decision making. Is that a fair comment?
I think minimising emotional decision making is a good rule of thumb anyway, yes. So whatever form removing the emotion from those important decisions comes, then I think that's a great outcome. And a long-term plan can certainly help remove the emotion.
Something I was interested in asking each of you was about, and it was along the sort of, kind of like the succession planning idea, but particularly when you think about coming into drought, and what triggers you use to decide what decisions you make, who else needs to be involved in those decisions? And you'll all have different answers to that because you're all structured differently. But is that something you think about, making sure that at particular trigger points, you have the right people at the decision-making table and that they're kind of on board with the plan? And is that part of it, do you think?
I'd say absolutely. Majority of us here probably run in a family situation, so there's 3 generations of family still involved somewhat in the farm. We can learn a lot from our ancestors, but our ancestors can also learn a lot from what's happening now and looking forward. I found one of the biggest changes for our business was training. So we did some training probably in the early 2000s, and that helped us set some goals, some short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, and for us to create a vision of what we wanted our farm and our business to look like in the future. So, going back to Chad's, what does 2040 look like? I think if everyone has that goal of, have their short, medium and long-term goals, then that's something they can look forward to, look at, readdress and go, well, that's achievable, maybe that's a bit not achievable, we might have to readjust that. But if it's there, if you've got it written down, you've got it on the board, on the wall, something you can always look at and your family can look at, and you can, I think, in periods of drought when things are tight, I think, I would recommend having an external facilitator come into your business and have a look at it without being emotionally tied to it and saying, well, I think, you could make this decision that would benefit your business and your family and your lifestyle. Because I know a lot of farmers get emotively tied up in their business with their livestock and the way they've done things in the past, and they don't look to an external facilitator to help them, and they're out there and they're in your community and then they're not that hard to access. And really, when things get tough, I think the communication is the key. So you've got to communicate with your financial advisors and your bank managers, your family, everyone that's, even your stock agents, so people know where you are and where your goals are and where you're trying to head. And the only other thing I would like to say is that in periods of drought, it's very easy to get tied to your farm 7 days a week. You've got to feed that mob of sheep every day. You've got to do that every day. It can be all consuming, and your business, you just get consumed in your business and the day-to-day running. But it's so important to have that external life outside that business. Go and have some fun. Go and have drinks. Go and have a game of cricket. Go and get off and enjoy life as it should be enjoyed, because it can be all too consuming in bad times.
Anybody else want to add to that?
No, I 100% agree. You've got to break up the monotony and there's more to life than just the day-to-day, grind of it in those periods. And, your family and your community, they're there. We all benefit from the interaction, and you just got to make the effort to do it. And, but it's like I said, every time it's different, and it'll be different again when it comes around. So, we just got to keep evolving and, making decisions.
Are there one last thing I'm going to ask, and then I'll give everybody the opportunity for a final question. Because of my background and my sort of penchant for trying to get people to work together, are there opportunities, do you think, for collaboration? And whether that be, sort of cooperative arrangements that we could think about now that would help make us more resilient for the future?
Well, one thing that I'm very, very passionate about, and I see more and more pressure, is in the area of us being price takers. And it's something that it bothers me greatly that we're seeing a shrinking in the number of players in the sheep meat industry. And these recent high prices are a real threat to some of the smaller players in processing. And I think it's a real step back for the industry if we end up in the hands of a few big players. And we're certainly as a business, we obviously, seed stock's a way of, although you don't remove yourself from the physical market, we ride the highs and lows with the commercial sector. We do have the ability to have more influence over the price received for our product, and we're in the process at the moment of trying to take that to another level and create a branded beef program, simply because we are not being paid for the quality of the product that we produce. And I'm not sure at community level how that works, but to me it doesn't make much sense that we produce some beautiful product here locally and we sell it to the big conglomerates, and some of it would end up back in the supermarkets here. But you look at all the local butchers and wouldn't it be great if our community lived off our local produce? And I know there's lots of people who had a bit of a crack at it, and it's something that you look at the multinationals and the profits they make, and they don't pour a whole lot of it back into the community. And I don't have the answers on it, but we're certainly having a look at it from our point of view as how we can be more in control of the price received for our product, because that flows directly through to your profit if you can enhance that. And and it's a great motivator, I think, for me anyway, to that you're very connected to what you produce, and if you can be rewarded financially along the way for what you actually turn off, that's a great win.
Anything else on the collaboration front?
I think the collaboration, and this is probably coming from a seed stock perspective as well, as in the industry we're in, there's so many different views on the direction we should be heading. So I think, setting that longer term path again is opening the door to stronger business, stronger industries and stronger people and communities on the back of that. How that collaboration comes together, I guess, could be linked back to communication, and communication skills are not something I guess farmers are necessarily known for. So maybe understanding the importance of communication and linking that to the importance of the story, and just how powerful a story can be when communicated to an audience that really has no idea what we're producing and why we do it. I think there's a massive opportunity there. At the moment, we're probably at the mercy of that story coming back against us, because it's the negative stuff that keeps being thrown back at us. But if we had a front foot approach to communicating our story, and every amazing image we share across the globe on social media, if we had an understanding of just how powerful that could be, we would front foot a lot of the attacks that are coming against agriculture in different ways. So I guess we've got the power in our hands, we're just choosing not to use it at this stage. But education can be the overarching, I guess, link to getting that in place. Bit off the topic for collaboration, but there's a broad link.
Particularly important in times of drought, when you really need the support of the cities, like to have that story as well, and to be able to communicate that story. Fiona, I think you've got one. Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll have a quick. That's very generous. Your comments. I agree that farmer to farmer chats are a really great way of sharing lived experiences. Another view of that could be that people love to share what they know. I'm actually more than happy to share with anyone that's interested. If our story has any way of resonating with other people to help them, then I'm more than happy to have the chat. I'm not against payment for people if that's an incentive for them to share their story, but I think a lot of people do love sharing what they know. So if we can create a forum for people to do that, and for people to learn from that, then it may just be the stage is the ticket to getting that connection going.
Any other? Yep, you've got one more. When we did the work in Gilgandra for their drought preparedness, something that came up there too was that a lot of the locals were, it's very emotionally draining to go through a drought yourself, and then they're being asked to also contribute to community events and, rallying the troops to keep everybody happy and to try and, generate some morale in the community, and that was very draining. So how do you attract volunteers that aren't in that situation who could come and help? I know that's a tangential to the payment idea, but it is this thing about you keep asking the same people for their time and their input, and when they're really backs against the wall, that's tough. All right, Gabby, yes?
I think it's hard to build resilience when times are good. I think it's the challenge that helps us build resilience. And, if the light and shade of life, I guess, if we spend all our time in the bright sunshine, the worst of the sunshine is going to be our worst experience. But it's not until we're pushed into the shade of life that we can start to appreciate the sun. And I'll give you an example of that. My son had a motorbike accident, smashed his foot, had weeks in hospital, ended up with an amputated big toe. And I was down, so I'd fly down to Sydney to to spend the weekend with my wife and son who are in Sydney Hospital. And I'd go down in the morning and get a coffee and then go back to the room. And I was down getting a coffee one morning, and this father just struck up a conversation with me. He said, "What brings you here?" And obviously we're at a cafe at a children's hospital. And I said, woe was me. My son's had a motorbike accident and he's just had his big toe amputated, and the world's a completely different place in my view. And that's not how I put it, but that's, I was just telling our story. And then I said to him, "So why are you here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm not sure we'll actually take our son home." I thought, wow, it's just a toe. So building resilience, I'm not saying I'm right on this, but I think we need a challenge to really learn from to build that resilience. And so I think we can do a lot of planning now for drought. But I think the heat of the drought, when the pressure's really on financially and emotionally, is when we really learn.
I'm a very fortunate person in that, I could stick myself on a farm isolated for months on end in drought and I'd still love it. And I'm a rare and maybe a little bit sick, but I honestly play in my sandpit every day, and I've always wanted to do it since a little tiny fella, and I've never wanted to do anything else. So I'm fortunate that I chose my love as my career, and
the only thing I'd like to say with the social media is I think it can be distracting, but it can also be such a powerful tool because, everyone's got one of these, and one of those has normally got one of those at the back of it. And I think we can communicate our story and get our story across the other side of the mountains with some social media. Because to me, there's such a huge divide between the city and the country still. And I could be wrong here, but it seems to me we're being dictated by the people over the other side of the mountains saying to us how we should be running our farm. Our country is so big, our world is so big, it's so diverse that it's not our couple of cows that are farting and burping is creating climate change. They need to get out of their box and see what is out here. And I think we can do that by conveying, through social media. And I'm certainly hoping, I think that story has started with part of some of our marketing. Some of our consumers want to see how our products are produced, and I think that is starting to happen. So hopefully we can use that tool to, get through to the other half that lives over the other side of the hill.
There's certainly, I think advocacy and agriculture is hugely lacking. You're probably there, Chad, at Landmax in Bendigo. It'd have to be 6-8 years ago now, and a bloke by the name of Trent Luce, he was an American, spoke, and he was very, very, he could see the writing on the wall back then that as producers, we don't tell our story, and the way we're perceived in the suburbs, there's a very big disconnect there, and I think it's our responsibility to sell our story and be proud of how we produce our products and how we look after our land and our people, and but we're as farmers we're not great at that, and I think I'm certainly not, and but it's desperately needed to break down that divide.
Anthony.
Thank you. Thanks for all your talks. I really enjoyed it. Just want to talk a bit about the succession planning, and you've all mentioned that you've been on the farm for multiple generations. I'm just wondering what you see, what the appetite is from the next generation to take over, or what the role of the multinationals and the corporates is, and then, how that all fits in with this comment around social media, because if you look on social media, you never have a bad time. And so this next generation might not be as prepared, whether they're from the country or the city, for the ups and downs, because they look at their mates and they're on holidays in Greece or wherever they are and all that sort of thing. And then also along that line, we mentioned in the first panel about AI and all this sort of stuff, and there's a lot of people that are going to be out of jobs because of AI. But one thing that AI can't do is produce stuff. And so looking at opportunities for, the labour force, and instead of them doing stuff over in the cities, what would convince them not to become farmers, but perhaps to get involved more in agriculture as a career that they otherwise wouldn't? I'm just interested in what you think about that. I guess you put your slide up before about 2040. Okay, so 2040 is 15 years from now.
Yeah.
What about 2090? What do you see it like then? Who's going to be running the farms?
Yeah, look, that's really speculative. I'd want to give that a lot more thought, I think, to give you a good answer. In terms of our succession, I've said to our kids, I have 3 children that I know of, that I have no preference in their career choice. It may be agriculture, it may be linked to agriculture, it may be completely different. I have no preference in the direction they take their career. The only thing I insist on is that whatever direction they take, they have a crack. We'll be able to set them up to a degree. If there's any sign of laziness or resting on their laurels, then that'll be the pull through for them that will come from us. So I don't have a preference in terms of our succession to the next generation. Where the next generation of farmers comes from, I'm happy to speculate on that if you'd like, for the sake of the question. And I think agriculture, and it sounds like Justin is well and truly struck with it, and I certainly was as a kid too. It's just in some people. So there may be doors we could open to facilitate the move of those people that can't afford the actual asset of land to be heavily involved in agriculture. It might be some sort of fund-through agreement, however that may look, for people who may be just on the edge of agriculture to be the next generation of people coming from a slightly different background to then take on the operational side of managing landscapes in whatever form that may be. It's really going to have to evolve, I think, in front of us for me to get my head around it. I don't have a clear picture of how it looks, but I think once the space opens up to an opportunity, there will people that will see that opportunity and take it. It's just who takes that opportunity I'm unclear on.
I think it's a tough question now. I think in our generation, our fathers' generation and our grandfather's generation, they have all been different. And I know when I came home, left school, did a little bit of work overseas and came home. I actually did an associate degree in agriculture after school, came home and, that's what was expected of us at that stage. So, Dad had worked his guts out all his life to create enough land for for my brother and myself, and he did it amazingly. But that was sort of our destiny. We were locked into it. When we came home, sheep and cattle prices weren't that crash. We went through droughts, and there wasn't much money out there. So we were actually working on I wouldn't almost call it slave labour. So it was really hard, and we didn't have goals and visions and business plans, and it was just day-to-day stuff that what we were doing. So that was back in the 80s. So and I think now things have changed a lot. There's a lot more coaching out there. There's a lot more business plans. There's more cooperation amongst farmers than there was back in the 80s. Really, back in the 80s, you didn't tell. You told your neighbour how much rain you got, but sometimes you asked him first so you could beat him. It was that type of mentality. I think things have changed a lot now. Going back to what Chad said, experience creates resilience, and I certainly noticed that. And it doesn't matter, how many years at ag college you did or how much training. It's that life experiences that really hit home, and that you learn from. As I say, you learn from your mistakes. There's no truer answer than that. But you also learn from the opportunities that are there. So I think the challenge for our generation, or the next generation, the younger generation coming through now, is that if they're actually not born into farming, or they're not, haven't got a property to go onto, how can they afford it? How can they, land prices are so high, costs are so high, it's tough for them. There are opportunities out there, and Justin's taken those opportunities, but sometimes it looks like it could be getting harder and harder. But yeah, I know with our family, communication is going to be the key to knowing exactly where, having a plan and setting out, what do you want to do. You don't have to stick to it, but just give us a bit of a plan.
I come from a bit different perspective from the fact that, my mother's family were from country at Wanaring, and my father managed his entire life in agriculture. And my wife and I, first generation, so we didn't inherit anything. We basically had 2 houses, sold them, bought some land. But I can remember when I left school, I finished at 17 and I did my HSL. I was quite good at school. I didn't get a great mark, but I could have gone to university. And I remember my dad lining me up the day after I finished my HSC, and he said, "What are you going to do, son?" And I said, "Oh, I hadn't really thought about it, Dad." And he said, "Well, you better start thinking, because one thing I can tell you you're not doing, and that's staying here." So he opened the door for me, and I said, well, I thought about it for 24 hours, and I said, well, I want to go and work for my granddad. That was out Wanaring. And he said, well, agriculture, he said, it's been a way of life for your mother and I, but he said, it's never been that good to us. But he said, I give you one bit of advice: if you're going to do it, you better be good at it. And I never forgot that moment and the way I went. And I suppose I just honed my craft and skills, and when we got the opportunity, we had a crack. And I think the one thing he always instilled in us, and it's the same as what Chad said, is he instilled a very strong work ethic, not just in myself, my brother and sister, and we've all done very well for ourselves. And I think that's the challenge I see as a parent, and it's a community, it's a worldwide challenge, I think, is where I'm not sure we've got that same hunger in the young generation, because, I mean, I've never had a tough day in my life. I mean, my dad's a Vietnam veteran. I acknowledge what he has been through. He's a terrific father and a good mentor to me. But, you know, our two boys, they live the life of Riley, and I really, as much as it's great, they're great kids and they're smart, and I'm just not sure whether that's setting them up for success. And our youngest bloke, he's very passionate about animals. I'll be highly surprised if he doesn't have a career to do with animals in some form. I share Chad's view that, you know, we'll support them in, you know, as best we can, but they certainly won't be getting any handouts, and there's no expectation that they'll inherit the asset. You know, from day one, we made, and I expect them to do the same. But I really think that it is a challenge, but I think without profitability, there is no future in any industry, and that's why I'm so hell-bent about what I said earlier about productivity and about profitability. The only way you're going to romance the next generation into agriculture is for it to be profitable. And when you look at the latest profit data RCS have constructed on return on assets, the last 2 years are deplorable, the lowest on record. And and they haven't been. I mean, we've had a downturn in commodities, and we've got volatility in the sector, but I think that's our big challenge, because our cost structure has gone through the roof in the last couple of years, and margins are getting squeezed. So people are more highly leveraged than ever, and I think our accountability in business and our need to understand the numbers and the finances of it have never been greater. It's not getting any easier, but I think it's very hard to romance the next generation into it if there's no money in it, and I think that's our greatest challenge is to find ways to create profitable businesses and ones that can handle leverage. That's our biggest challenge.
I'm going to say thank you very much and ask everybody to join me in thanking our three wonderful panellists and presenters, and wish you all the best for the rest of the Roadshow. So thanks very much.